We're looking tonight at stress and resilience, really, building up our children's resilience. And we'll talk as we go through about exactly what that means, what that term means. My name is Heather Clayton. I'm the Director of Learning here at St. Michael's, began in September, and so I have the privilege of working primarily with staff and somewhat with parents, and just looking at the learning that's going on in the school, supporting teachers in their practice and their understanding of how students learn, and just with all of the research that is going on in our world right now, trying to be the funnel or the vessel for sharing some of that with them. I'm really excited because I did a couple of sessions on my own in the fall, and for this session, Virginia Ronning, who's our head of counseling here at the school, has partnered with me on this in terms of actually the preparation and the delivery. And she's the director of, or the head of counseling, and also part of a new wellness initiative, which she'll tell you a little bit more about in her section tonight. So it's an exciting night for us. And what I wanted to start with very quickly is a commercial or two. You got a little flyer with your package when you came in, and we're really fortunate as a school, very excited that in April John Medina will be coming, and so our Pro D Day as a whole staff, K to 12, will be working with John Medina on understanding brain research, in particular its applications to the classroom and to education. I don't know if any of you are familiar with John Medina. He writes a lot. One of his really popular books is called Brain Rules, and I think there's a Brain Rules for Babies now. And he really is looking at a variety of topics in a really fascinating way, kind of considering the research, but it's very readable and very relevant. So John Liggett, who's our Director of Academics, asked that I extend to you an invitation for that, knowing that if you choose to come as parents, you're very welcome, and the focus of the day will be on education and on helping to improve your students' experience here at St. Michael's. The second little commercial, which isn't up there, but you may or may not know about, is it's the book sale for the library. I don't want you all to jump up now and run out, but it will be going on till 9 o'clock tonight, and again all day tomorrow and Saturday. Saturday, I think it's 12 to 4 or something. So that's a really neat cause. They're raising money to put a roof on a school in a third world country, and it's also an amazing deal. I went in today and walked out with a box of books for like $8. So there's some really neat opportunities, I guess, in that. So what are we going to be focusing on or talking about tonight? And I really feel, as I was preparing this, that I was coming to you with a couple of hats. One was the Director of Learning and kind of observing students and teachers and being in classes and just looking at all that they're doing, not only in their learning, but also in the extracurricular things that go on. Listening and talking and working with teachers as they try to manage all of the pieces, and again, watching students do that. But I come to you also with a parent hat, and that is that, you know, as we all have children, and you're here because you do, we wish the best for them. We want to create places and opportunities for them that are just help them become the best they can be, to sort of rise to their potential. And in doing that, there's some tricky bits to that, isn't there? Because we have to make choices and we have to figure out what that means for each one of our children. And surprisingly enough, I have 3 children, and really they're not the same, right? They're different beings and they need different things. The other thing is that I've come to realize more and more that my own management of stress as a parent, my own ability to cope with things that happen and the ways that I cope, I'm modeling that for my kids, and they're coming to see how me, as one of the primary adults in the home, deal with stress. And you know, I'm glad you don't videotape our home. Some days that's not something I'd want others to be seeing, but it is a reality in the day-to-dayness of our lives that we are also the models for our kids around stress. So what we thought we would do tonight is spend a little bit at the beginning talking about and looking at maybe some of the brain research that might connect with stress and the idea of resilience and what sort of happens to us physiologically, emotionally. And then the bulk of our time is going to be spent looking at some strategies to build resilience. Some of the feedback we got from our last brain session that I did was we really want to make this practical, hands-on discussion. Like the science, want to hear more of the practical stuff. So I've heard that, and we're hoping to accommodate that tonight. So the goals then, just to sort of sum, we'll be able to to look at stress and resilience, and then to shift our thinking and actions from a place of stress to a place of resilience. Stress is a weighty term, kind of drags us down. Resilience is a different way of kind of considering the same kinds of ideas, but with some options and some possibilities. Just to get us started, because often before we get started, I will just, actually show you this slide. It was in both of the last couple of presentations that I did. And really what I wanted to say about tonight is when we talk about resilience and when we talk about stress, we're focusing on a couple of primary areas of the brain. One is the prefrontal cortex, that's sort of reasoned part of our brain. And the other is the amygdala, the emotional center of our brain. And I'll speak to you more about that, but I like to kind of give you a roadmap about where it is that we're going. So I want to start, one of the things that brain research talks about is when we're going to think about something, it's kind of good to activate our thinking in that area. It's kind of good to activate that prior knowledge would be the term. So on page 7 of your handout, and hopefully you all have a little something to write with, I want us to start thinking about what it is that we do, how we perceive what happens to us. So there are some questions on that sheet. The first one is I want you to think about a time when you suffered some kind of failure or disappointment. Something just didn't go the way you wanted it to go, and so you had a failure. So the first piece is what happened, and that's kind of you thinking about the scenario for about 30 seconds. Hopefully you've all had something you can think about that maybe didn't go quite the way you thought it should have or would have. And then how did you get through that difficult time? And in that, I'm just looking for some point form. I mean, did you journal? Did you go to a counselor? Did you talk to a good friend? What were the strategies that you put in place for yourself at that difficult time? And then that's sort of a writing piece. And how did you pick yourself back up? So what were those internal and external kinds of supports? Those may be kind of similar questions, I'm thinking, as I'm reading it, but anyway, answer them as best you can. And know that we're not going to find a partner and share this. We've done this in our other sessions. But this is just for your own reflection. So we're just going to take a minute or two and have you think about that, and then we'll kind of be in a place, I think, of learning more about this together. So what happened? Think about that. What did you do to sort of make your way? What were the strategies you used to make your way through that? And what sort of internal and external supports did you draw on? So kind of going down that road, as you look at what you've written and you're reflecting about that, I want you to think for a minute. You don't have to write anymore, but I want you to think for a minute. What if you asked your children the same questions? Honey, when was it that you went through a hard time? When was it that you felt discouraged or like you'd failed at something? What sort of strategies or supports did you use to pull yourself up? What kinds of things, and again, we don't have to shout this out, but what kinds of things might our kids say to that? It's interesting. So what we're hoping to do this evening is really sort of do some deeper thinking about how we understand stress. We want to think about its impact on our brain and therefore its impact on our relationships, on our body. But we also want to understand resilience because resilience is sort of a key to coping with stress and building a fuller life. And I think most importantly, because it's a parent session, we're here because we want to help our children create ways of thinking and helping them work through the times when they're making mistakes and things go wrong in their world. So as we sort of dive into this, and I'm just going to do the little section at the beginning about the brain and that sort of thing, and then Virginia's going to help us with some strategies around that. I think it's really important for us to define resilience. And one of the definitions that I found, which is up there, is the ability to thrive in spite of risk or adversity. When I looked at resilience in some different places, it talked about the positive capacity of people to cope with stress and adversity. The coping may result in an individual bouncing back to a previous state of normal functioning, or using the experience of adversity to produce a stealing effect, right? That getting stronger, inner kind of strength. Resilience is most commonly understood as a process, not a trait. for an individual. In other words, we're always kind of growing and developing the idea of resilience. And so I was pulling out some key words that for me jumped out when I thought of resilience: coping, a stealing effect, a process, bouncing back. These are things that are echoed then when we look at resilience and the idea of a spring, or something metal that bends but then returns to its original form. It isn't broken by whatever the experience is that causes the bending. And so we want to keep that kind of image in our mind as we're thinking about stress and resilience tonight. Resilience comes from both inner strengths and external supports. And we're all different beings, and as are our children, right? And there are things that can knock one of our kids totally off their feet, whereas another just kind of rides through it, and you think, that's really interesting. And all of us as people are like that. So we have some different kinds of inner strength. One of the articles we read talked about that coming sort of from DNA, our temperament, that sort of thing. And then we have those external supports, the environment that we're in, the role models that we have, those sorts of things. And they act together to build the resilience within ourselves. And communities such as this one can help to really build those strengths. And it's when you have sort of opportunities for positive development and growth that kids can thrive. And so the more time that I spend, and I'm relatively new to this place compared to many of you, the more I'm grateful for the many positive kinds of opportunities that happen here for our kids. So why do we need to build resilience? Well, there's a lot of reasons. It's very rare that we can just sort of slide through life and it doesn't present us with some challenges. And so there's a good list there in terms of thinking about how and why would we need to build, mostly why, I guess, would we need to build resilience. And so again, when we think about our kids, yeah, when I send my children off to university, I want to know that some of these things are in place, because I'm not going to be able to be there beside them, and because they're going to bump up against, as I'm hearing this week, my kids are here for reading week, profs that, they go, why did he do that? Why did he put that? All the challenges that come when our children leave our homes, and some that come even as they're still there. The World Health Organization's talking about, and again, this is sort of the compelling why around resilience, that we're going to be a society that, because of, I think, a lot of stress and environment, that sort of thing, we're creating a whole lot of mental health needs, and they're going to be the top expenses that companies and businesses in our societies are going to have to look at in the next number of years. So 1 in 4 will experience a mental health issue. And we really are concerned and looking at and wanting to talk about the increasing number of youth with depression and anxiety. Why is that? What's happening there? And what are the kinds of things that a community here or families can do to support our kids so that we don't have to go down that road necessarily? So let's just look for a minute at the brain and see if there's some things in there that might kind of help us when we're thinking about what's going on. Sometimes brain research, there are lots of different names given to different parts of the brain depending on who's doing the research and what the focus is. So the neocortex is sort of the logical brain, and for our purposes can also be called the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of our brain, I don't know if you remember previous sessions, but we talked about it kind of being the last bit developed, but the part that kind of can reason and say, okay, if this, then this, or if I do this, this will be the consequence. That's the prefrontal cortex part of our brain. Below that is the limbic system. That's where the amygdala lives. That's kind of the emotional center of the brain. And that part of our brain is scanning all the time, looking for cues for danger or interest. It triggers the emotion. And it stores important events through long-term memory. So often there's emotion attached to important events, and that's accessed through that system. And finally, at the base is the reptilian brain, the survival brain. And that's where we get our fight or flight kind of response. And that's the part that was geared for our survival in the wild. I don't know if you remember, but I had said previously, our brains are wired for survival primarily. But sometimes, John Medina talks a little bit about this, the things that we were wired for as, cavemen and women or whatever in the past. It's not, we have different stresses and challenges now. And so we cope with a brain that may react in a fight or flight way, and we have to deal with the stress that comes out of that. So, but when you start to look at these, it's interesting to note that there are lots of pathways in our brain from the emotional part of our brain to the reptilian part of our brain, right? So the feeding and understanding the emotions to the survival part of our brain. There are some messages also going from that part of our brain to the prefrontal cortex part of our brain. But there are far fewer kind of going from that thinking, particularly when we're talking about young people, going from that thinking prefrontal cortex part and feeding into the emotional. So what does that mean? It means that, again, we are wired for survival, and that sometimes our emotional stuff is a lot more hardwired. And so we find ourselves reacting in various situations. I talked a bit about this once before, but the idea that pain is pain. And I think when we talk about stress and we talk about perhaps failure, those sorts of things, we have to think about the emotional pain that comes from that. And what's interesting to note is, according to brain research, if you fall down and break your leg, that shows up in a pain center in your brain. And if you're hurt by a friend or you suffer some sort of a rejection or a failure emotionally, that shows up in the same kind of center in the brain. And so it registers. So pain is pain. So, you know, sometimes we can maximize that whole physical. You skinned your knee as a child, all these things that happen. But a little rejection from a friend or something like that can feel to a child similar, and is actually, in fact, being processed in a similar way in the brain. I showed you the amygdala at the beginning. And again, these are just things to think about as we start to process. Why do we react? Why do we see things the way that we do? The amygdala's job is to sort of scan all of the stimuli, all of the senses for emotionally charged data. So it's like the brain's danger and opportunity protector, was how one author described it. So the amygdala is going to be scanning and making a decision about whether to avoid or to approach or to avoid whatever, the discussion, the situation, and so on. So how does it do that? Well, it does it by reading facial expressions. The face has dozens of muscles, and the only purpose of many of those muscles is to convey the face's emotional state. So the amygdala and somebody else is watching all of those muscles in your face. It does this by reading tone of voice, right? So it can pick up on a sound, what that does, and it starts to create within your own self a response. And finally, it does this by reading the eyes. And I think it's really interesting to note that eyes can send a lot of messages. And as we think about our youth, and sometimes, you know, when you're dealing, not necessarily in this context, but with other youth that are aggressive and so on, even making eye contact can sometimes aggravate a situation. So we want to think about, but eyes can also convey interest and engagement and all of those great things. So our amygdala is reading all of these senses, and it's trying to decide, is this a good scenario? Is this a comfortable relationship? Is this somebody that I trust? And our brain really wants, as humans, we really want to be close, and we want to trust others. And the amygdala is that gateway to trust. So it decides, is someone safe? Are they not? And it can sort of spot the inconsistencies. So when you get that feeling sometimes in your stomach where it's like, they're talking to me, but something just isn't sitting right. And that's sort of that part of your brain processing and kind of intuitively saying, I don't know, something not right here. When we interpret that we can trust somebody else and they trust us, our brain excretes oxytocin, which is a chemical that sort of, again, leads to social bonding. So you can see that if Virginia and I are having a conversation, I'm really liking what she's saying and she's opening up to me, and then the result is I would open up back. Your brain is actually in action, right? It's saying, oh, this is a good relationship, and it's preparing and it's secreting the oxytocin, which the message is, yeah, I can trust, yeah, it's good. And so that builds. Trust begets more trust. But what happens if that doesn't happen, right? And so we also think about the times when, if the amygdala detects, a tone of voice, a look, a face, then it will pull back. It doesn't physically pull back, but it will send messages, and we'll feel ourselves pulling back. Oh, you can't even really see. Those are two guys yelling at each other. the brain is designed for survival. So we've already talked about that. And the idea sometimes, and we may get into this with our kids, the sort of tit-for-tat discussion, right? You have a child who's reacting, and then you react, and then it can sort of escalate. And that idea of how do you engage? But our brains, our aggression and our amygdala and our emotional response are kind of heightening, and in so doing, we're creating a heightened response in someone else. So most of our stress hopefully doesn't look like that, but it is a reality for our brains. And many of us have heard sort of the ideal level of stress, right? Oh yeah, there's an ideal level of stress. A little stress is okay, but not too much. But where's that line? Like, who will tell us where that line is? And it may be different for different people and different adults as well as kids. So we need to have some stress, but not too much, or these sorts of things start to be impacted. How am I doing? I keep dropping all my pages. I thought this was a really interesting quote. John Medina said, "The way we view stress will determine how our brain and our body reacts. And whether or not it will be harmful for us depends on how much of a sense of control we have over our lives." It's really interesting. In his book, he has a whole chapter on stress. And he talks about the impact of stress on our body. And he says that the worst kind of stress is when you feel like you have no control, when you feel helpless. And so this is what we want to work on and talk about tonight, is the idea that we don't need necessarily to feel helpless. So what do we do when our kids come home and they're feeling, stressed by some things? How do we help them move from that place of feeling helpless to finding some solutions? So we're going to sort of hand off here. And are there any questions and comments, though, about the brain? Maybe what would be good, actually, just because it's evening, is just to turn to somebody or take a step or two, or somebody you're with. Just talk about one or two things we just talked about that kind of jumped out at you. It's for that summarizing part, and then we'll move into some solutions for resilience.